Tena koto, tena koto, tena tato katoa. My name is Jay Marlowe. I'm an associate professor of social work at the University of Auckland and co-director for the Center for Asia-Pacific Refugee Studies. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to Refugees as Survivor New Zealand's second webinar on seeking asylum in New Zealand. We've got three great panelists that are here to speak with us, and I'll introduce them to you shortly. The plan is that we're going to talk with them for about 40 minutes around some of the issues and perspectives around seeking asylum in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And during that time, it'd be great if you could be clicking on that chat function that's just below the screen there for you. So if you have any questions or things that you would like to discuss, those are things that we can possibly cover within this panel in the remaining 15 or 20 minutes. So with that said, one thing that I would like to emphasize is that the refugee and forced migration sector is very small here in New Zealand, and that the people that work in it are incredibly committed. And so the perspectives and issues that we might cover are certainly not intended in any way as a personal critique, and rather that this is done in the constructive spirit of trying to broaden our understandings. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our three panelists, Bernard Sama, Tim Maurice, and Deborah Manning. Bernard, would you like to go ahead and start?
Kia ora, New Zealand and the rest of the world. I am Bernard Sama, a former asylum seeker and presently a citizen of New Zealand. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Auckland, and my thesis looks at how the refugee status determining process in New Zealand could be made safer and better for both the asylum seekers as well as the professionals that work with them. Awesome.
Great, many thanks, Bernard. Welcome. Tim.
Yeah, kia ora everyone. My name's Tim Maurice. I'm the General Manager of the Asylum Seekers Support Trust. So we're a charitable organisation that offers practical support for asylum seekers and convention refugees in New Zealand.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, Deborah Manning.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a lawyer in refugee law, 22 years this year. And over these years, I've been an active member of the NGO sector, the Refugee Council of New Zealand, the Human Rights Foundation and bar organisations. So I'm working regularly with all of the lawyers working in refugee law, and I am active in all aspects of the refugee determination system, from the Refugee Status Unit to the Immigration Protection Tribunal, and sometimes up to the High Court and beyond.
Right. Many thanks, Deborah. And certainly a warm welcome to everyone who's attending. We have more than 165 registrations to this event. And I see that we've got the Human Rights Commissioner who's also joined us as well. So welcome. Just to kick things off, you know, the public is oftentimes not aware of maybe some of these distinctions when we talk about asylum seekers, quota refugees, convention refugees. Sometimes even our politicians get really confused with these terms. I was wondering, Bernard, if you could help us to understand what some of those distinctions and what those terms mean.
Oh, sure. An asylum seeker, asylum seekers are people who make their way to New Zealand and claim refugee and protection status, either on arrival or sometime after being in the country. There is a very robust process laid down in law for that, for the determination process to be made. If the asylum seeker is successful either at the refugee status unit or the Immigration and Protection Tribunal, then the person becomes a convention refugee. So besides asylum seekers and convention refugees, we have another pathway, which is the main pathway that people from refugee background come to New Zealand. These are quota refugees. They are people that have been recognized as refugee or protected persons abroad by the UNHCR, and the New Zealand government has a very formal process where they are resettled into New Zealand yearly. And we also have another category of refugees who are the family reunion refugees would be the family members of convention refugees or of quota refugees. I think that should be good.
I could also
Hey,
just,
thanks.
Yes.
if I could just add something to that. Thank you, Bernard.
Yeah.
When I first started practicing 20 or so years ago, many of the asylum seekers, the majority were border claimants, so people who came into Auckland Airport and claimed on arrival. Now that's a very tiny minority, and many of the applications are people who have come here on student visas or for other reasons. And one of the reasons for that is because there's been a very strong deterrent policy from the New Zealand government to have something called interdiction, which is where they had immigration officers standing at ports screening people to make sure that people weren't coming with false documentation, but of course that screened out genuine asylum seekers, and also advanced passenger screening. So New Zealand does everything they can to basically screen out asylum seekers from even getting here. And there's also just another category known as refugees surplus. So that might be people who were in New Zealand and then after they arrived here, circumstances changed in their home country and they needed to claim refugee status. So they didn't come to New Zealand for that purpose.
Right, many thanks for that distinction, Deborah. And so one of the things that, I guess that I heard you say was that, for quota refugees, that come to New Zealand, they already have refugee status. The convention refugees, they don't have refugee status when they come to New Zealand. They apply for it as asylum seekers. Tim, I'm wondering, or maybe if anyone else, why is it that someone would want to apply for refugee status?
Yeah, sure. Could be a whole bunch of reasons. There's a lot of different reasons why people might want to apply. It could be threat from the government in their home country or the police forces. It could be domestic violence. They're unable to be protected in their home country. So it's just basically a fear of persecution. So yeah, it's a very individual process for a lot of people. You can't really say this is the reason people claim asylum because everybody has different reasons why they come.
And they would seek that status in New Zealand because it would provide them with certain protections, or?
Yeah, so they seek status in New Zealand through the process, and then they can either get recognised as a refugee, and I think Deborah might jump in here with the legal side of it, or it's a protected person, and they have slightly different status, but basically the same result, that they're allowed to stay in New Zealand. We're saying to them, you can stay here, this is a safe place for you and your family to call home.
Right. So it provides them that protection from those well-founded fears of persecution. That's part of the refugee definition. And I think that's a great segue into Deborah around sort of once someone actually applies for refugee status in New Zealand as an asylum seeker, what exactly is that pathway? How does that work?
Yeah, so there are two metaphors I use for clients when they first come to see me. The first, I say, to get refugee or protected person status, you have to meet a legal definition. And that is like threading a needle. There's a very small definition and you need to make sure that you fit it. So we need to be able to show that someone has a well-founded fear of persecution in their home country for one of 5 reasons, and that's under the Refugee Convention. The second metaphor I use is that claiming refugee status is like climbing a very big mountain. It's a very intensive legal process. So at the first level, once you make your application, it's a 26-page form. You then are put into a process which a main point is an interview, which on average is a 7-hour interview. Again, when I first started, it was a 3-hour interview, and in the UK and Australia and Canada, it tends to be 3 hours. New Zealand is over double the length. And so it's a very intensive process. There's a lot of documentation, a lot of evidence having to be given to the client, a lot of evidence needs to be provided in terms of witness evidence, corroborating documentation, and so on. And so that's at the first level. Something like 70% of those cases are declined. Usually on credibility reasons, the person is not believed. And then they can go up to the tribunal for an appeal. And again, that's typically a 1 to 2 day hearing where the person is also being asked, hundreds of questions. All evidence is being checked and cross-checked. All statements are being checked and double-checked for consistency, for implausibility. And again, it's a very demanding and rigorous process. something that I've been really struck with recently. I've just been through a couple of really challenging appeals, and it's just really reinforced to me how the system is very skewed towards favouring people with tertiary education. You really need to have those skills of tertiary education to be able to manage in this process because of the levels of documentation and information that's required of asylum seekers. So people who don't have those levels of education really struggle to participate in the process.
So that's great. And so it sounds like they apply for asylum. Their request is first considered by the refugee status unit. If that isn't successful, then it sounds like they've got to appeal to the Immigration Protection Tribunal. And then from what I understand, if that's not successful, they can then appeal to the minister. But can you sort of explain the role of you as a lawyer in that process?
Yeah.
Of trying to thread this needle and climbing the mountain?
Sure. I was recently writing a 2-page summary document on the role of lawyers in refugee law, and it's now 10 pages. It's an extremely demanding and challenging role, very different to other areas of law. So as a refugee lawyer, you need to be guiding your client through the process, explaining the process. And so it's a totally foreign process to clients because it's a Western legal system. You're needing to explain what the role of the lawyer is, because often clients think it's the lawyer's job to do everything, because often in their home country, the lawyer does everything. But this is the process that's very reliant upon clients being able to explain their account. You're needing to obtain evidence for your clients, getting statements from witnesses and documentation. We're often having to guide them through the visa system in New Zealand, because everyone needs to have a visa, and there's no legal aid for that. There is some legal aid available for refugee cases, but there's no legal aid for visas. We're often called upon to help them with their social work and so on, but with the Asylum Seekers Trust, especially over the last couple of years, that's taken a huge burden off the lawyers. But, you know, we often get clients coming to us who are hungry and don't have anywhere to live, and so we are called upon doing that kind of work. So we essentially have to carry this human being who is, by definition as a refugee, stressed and traumatized through a process which can take 6 to 12 to 24 months. It's a very intensive role, as well as needing to try and plug them into mental health services and health services, which are incredibly underfunded and stretched. So it's a very demanding role.
Great. Thanks, Deborah. So, I mean, Tim, can you give us maybe a rough sense of numbers? I mean, how many people are we talking about here? And I guess, you know, could you also maybe outline, you know, we talk about convention refugees, which are people who come as asylum seekers and seek refugee status in New Zealand, and then quota refugees who come from offshore. Are there any differences? I mean, does New Zealand treat them differently? So if you could just give us a sense of numbers, and then maybe if there are, what differences exist between convention and quota refugees?
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of numbers, last year 502 people claimed asylum. That was heading for around 600 before the lockdown. The year before was 510. Numbers are increasing. These are the highest numbers we've had since, I think, 2003, 2004, which is pre the period Deborah talked about where we screen people before they get on the aeroplane. Of those, about 35% are accepted at RSU level. That's been pretty consistent over the last 6 years. Between 32 and 36% of claimants are successful there. And the IPT, last year 100 of the 204 were accepted, so around 50%. So last year we had 250 new convention refugees arrive in the country. Just while I'm on my stats run, China is our main claimant. China, followed by India, Sri Lanka, Iran and Malaysia. Those are the top 5 countries that claim in New Zealand. In terms of acceptances though, the top country is China, followed by Iran and Afghanistan as a claimant. So once you're accepted in New Zealand, there's 250 people who were accepted this year. What they get from the government is they get a letter of congratulations from either IPT or RSU, and then they get a navigator phone call, one phone call about 2 to 3 months later. So there's no resettlement support at all for convention refugees. Quota refugees have their process that they go through, but for convention refugees, there's nothing. For example, there's a WINS allowance of $1,200 resettlement grant for refugees, but you must claim that within 1 year of being in the country. And because the process of claiming asylum is so slow, many convention refugees miss out on having access to this. Convention refugees don't automatically get given residence. The quota refugees arrive with residence. And why that's important is that's access to a number of benefits. Also, convention refugees do not automatically get given visas once they're accepted. So we've had a client who was accepted in November, and hopefully his benefit should go through this week. So since November, he's not been allowed to work and not been able to get any government support. Usually the process is around 6 to 8 weeks. So where people get released from prison, have been accepted as refugees, and then for 6 to 8 weeks, not allowed to work, no money. Have to survive on $0 and not knowing anyone. So the pathway for a convention refugee is very difficult. And I think it's a reasonably easy fix. As I said, only 250 people last year. If convention refugees are treated as refugees, not migrants, through the immigration system, if they're issued with residence when they're accepted, if they're issued with work visas when they're accepted, the process would be much easier.
Right. So I guess one of the questions, we've now got questions coming in fast and furious, which is really great. And I'm going to try to see if, as we're talking about some of these things, maybe to see if I can just slot a few of those in. But I just see one question here, which is there an official quota for convention refugees annually? Can someone address that question?
No, there isn't, and there can't be, because you can only claim refugee status if you're onshore, and there's no ability to apply to come onshore to claim asylum in New Zealand.
And are you legally allowed to apply for asylum?
Yes, it is an absolute right in international law of the right to apply for asylum. And the Refugee Convention was, created after the horrors of World War II, with all the people being turned back from being able to leave Nazi Germany and claim asylum. And so it was recognised that there is an inherent right in us all to be able to seek asylum if it's too dangerous for us to be in our home countries. But we've got this problem, which is that you can only apply for asylum if you're in the country where you're seeking asylum. You've got no ability to get here. And so, New Zealand, like other refugee convention countries, are a fortress. They don't want people coming in. So it's only those people who've been able to sort of sneak through the moat to get through the castle walls who can apply. But even once they do apply, as Tim has explained, they're treated worse than third-class citizens. They're treated as absolute fraudsters who are gaming the system, and until they can prove otherwise, it's very hard for them to, get access to economic, social, cultural rights here.
Great. I've had a few questions, Tim, where people have asked about funding for convention refugees and support, and if that's different in any way. Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, so obviously we don't get any government funding, so we're reliant on philanthropic trusts. So shout out to J.R. McKenzie and Foundation North and Office in the Communities, thank you, and donations from our supporters. And it's the same thing with convention refugees. Like I said, they just get a letter. There's no resettlement support. And as you can imagine, you're in a brand new country, often with limited language skills, being told you can stay here, you're safe, but then not given any resettlement support. So the journey is a very long, slow one for them to be able to integrate into our communities. We really need to look at a similar program to the quota refugees with volunteer supports and access to social work, so people can integrate quicker. They can become a part of our communities much quicker and contribute to them.
Great, many thanks. And before we just move on to the next topic, which we might talk about some of the major issues that you see, which I think are already being highlighted already. I just wondered, Bernard, if you could just tell us a little bit more about your PhD and why you're doing that.
Yeah, it sort of comes from my personal experience of having to go through the process, and it was it's challenging, as Deborah and Tim have highlighted, and then and for me particularly, I was coming from a background where I studied law and was doing human rights work in the Cameroons, so I sort of started asking myself that if, as someone who has a good knowledge of the law and if being someone from that background with a law degree and having to look at this process and see how challenging it is, what about the common person that has got no knowledge of the law? So I then started looking at other ways or theories in law that can help inform this process of refugee status determination. And I then read more on the legal theory of therapeutic jurisprudence. And what that is just, it asks that as lawyers, decisioners involved in legal processes, we should look at the way the process is structured and think about how we could improve the emotional and psychological well-being of everyone that is involved in the process without compromising the law.
Right.
And I thought that would be theory to use for this process.
Fantastic. One of the questions I've seen it come up in a few different ways now, but Tim, there are these questions around, with the Asylum Seeker Support Trust being funded only by charities. I mean, if that didn't happen, what would happen to people who are currently current asylum seekers? What would happen to them?
Well, we've seen it before, so we can only help so many people, unfortunately. So what we see from people who are unable to engage with our support is they get stuck in very vulnerable positions. They're often left without a visa, which means that they're not allowed to work and they get access to no support. So they end up staying at friends' houses, which only last so long, sleeping in mosques, often end up in servitude. So said, yeah, you can stay here, but you need to work 40 hours a week in my shop to pay for it. And this happens way too often, and it's happening right now in New Zealand, that people without visas are getting stuck in really difficult positions.
And I guess even further highlights the importance of the work of the Asylum Seeker Support Trust in filling that gap. Go ahead, Deborah.
So yeah, I was just going to say, there's the issue. A key issue is people's access to a visa, and from July last year, there was this real kind of clampdown in Immigration New Zealand about the ability for asylum seekers to access visas, which basically caused chaos in the system and massive stress and distress. And that I see that Ming Foon has asked what can be done. Well, the Human Rights Commission actually looking into how INZ processes visas for asylum seekers would be incredibly helpful. The delays are appalling and the arbitrary decision making is just unacceptable. And the other issue about funding, the Asylum Seeker Trust, we've had different models over the last 20 plus years, and an immigration-based funding model is definitely not the answer. It needs to be independently funded so that the Asylum Seekers Trust doesn't get tied to the immigration service, because we've got this unfortunate aspect in refugee status determination where you've got the refugee status unit, which is part of the immigration service, which is part of the executive branch, which has got issues to do with compliance, fraud, border, controls and so on. And so unfortunately, we've always sort of got this tension in refugee law of this fraud versus genuine refugee. And so we saw when years ago when immigration was funding, an NGO, it was a very unhappy situation. So there needs to be a guaranteed, in my view, independent funding source of social worker support for asylum seekers.
Right, and I mean, I think we've already moved into some of the major issues and that we're seeing in the sector. And I mean, I've seen questions popping up about language access, study link, disparate policy responses between convention and quota refugees, questions about Mount Eden. The list goes on and on. I guess
to type some responses in in the chat box. Is that all right if I just type some answers?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. So Deborah will start typing away as we talk as well. But I guess this is. I mean, before I ask more specific questions from the audience, I wonder if there's any issues that you particularly wanted to highlight that were particularly important to you.
Yeah, I'll jump in because one of the main issues we're working on at the moment to try and stop is the detention of asylum seekers in prison. So currently, if you claim at the border, around 60 people came at the border last year, and around 20 of those were detained. And the detention, unfortunately, we don't have a separate immigration facility, so they end up using Mount Eden Correctional Facility. And corrections don't treat asylum seekers any differently to any other person that they take care of. So they're locked to a cell of criminals, they're strip searched when they turn up, they're chained into vans when they're transported to court, and they're kept in on 28 days warrants of commitments. We just had a person released thanks to some work from Amnesty International who've been in jail for over 3 years just for seeking somewhere safe to call home. We just think that this practice has to stop. We have the Mangere Refugee Centre available to be used. We have charities like ourselves that are willing to house people rather than detaining them in prison.
Great. And I guess that reinforces that idea that seeking asylum is actually a right. That there's not they actually haven't done anything wrong in doing that.
And New Zealand's approach to the detention of asylum seekers is quite frankly shocking. You know, New Zealanders sort of look across the ditch to Australia and think, oh, well, we're not like Australia. In my view, the only reason we're not like Australia is because we don't get the numbers. But actually, in terms of the conditions in which we detain our asylum seekers, it's no different. You know, we've got asylum seekers in the Mount Eden remand prison. I've had more clients than I can count who have been beaten up, been in fight clubs, tried to commit suicide, been sexually assaulted and attacked. And we have for decades asked Immigration and Corrections to not house asylum seekers in a penal institution, and we have just got nowhere. We've raised it with officials, we've raised it with ministers, and because the numbers are so small, it's not considered significant enough to shift the dial. But you know, it's really shocking how we treat asylum seekers in our prison institutions.
And I mean, one of the things that I've seen the term used a few times in this webinar chat already around this notion of a queue jumper. Can you help us understand what's being termed by there, and do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's obviously brought up quite often, and I guess it's the idea that there is some sort of queue to wait in. And for many people in countries, there is no queue. There are many countries that do not have refugee camps that you can go to in neighbouring countries. There's also the problem that I think this year there might be 50 or 60,000 refugees resettled out of 71 million displaced people. If you're sitting in and I can't talk from personal experience, I think Bernard would be quite good, but if I was sitting in a country and the police were threatening my family and I had the financial means to escape, I would take that option.
Any other thoughts?
This is a really divisive, dangerous discourse that we constantly hear. And Tim's put it perfectly. There is no queue to jump. What are people supposed to do?
Great. Bernard, are there any particular issues that you would like to highlight or perspectives that you'd like to put forward?
Yeah, one very important issue that I think it just came up this year is in terms of how policy is being interpreted for the immediate family members of convention refugees. So this, once a convention refugee has been recognized, they are allowed, an asylum seeker has been recognized as a convention refugee, they are allowed to sponsor their family members, because usually for many of us, we come here by ourselves. We have to find a way here and then go through the process if we are successful, and then we could bring our family members. And but when we go through that process and are now accepted that our family members can come here and live safe in this country, the challenge we sort of noticing recently is that the government policy says that the family members of refugees, protected persons, can access, sponsored into New Zealand, can access tertiary education support. That is study link, as it's called in New Zealand, which would be student allowance and student loan. But I'm having a case where the government department in charge has been declining the application for the immediate family members of convention refugees who are already at university and studying, and now the students are stranded at school because they don't have the means of daily support to go through. And the argument is being that there seem to be the policies being interpreted in a way that's in a careful manner to exclude these people until we're here for at least 3 years before we could. So we are virtually being treated as migrants. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just elaborate. So there's a problem. There's two sets. There's the direct families of refugees are being declined access to StudyLink, even though extended families are being included in the current interpretation, which makes not a lot of sense, obviously. Also, convention refugees are being excluded. So quota refugees come with residency. StudyLink say you must have residency. So if you're a convention refugee and you want to study, you're not able to access StudyLink for 3 years. After you've had residency. And it's just a silly, the whole idea of StudyLink is people who are going to stay in our country, get access to support so they can improve themselves, improve our country, do better. But because of the interpretations of StudyLink, it's not happening.
Okay, great. I'm just to make sure that if you can just send your questions through the Q&A section as opposed to the chat. I'll try to get to both of them, but that means I'm monitoring 2 different screens. Another question that's just sort of emerged that I think relates to some of these key issues is one around language access. Are you able to talk through how well that works when people that apply for asylum here in New Zealand, if they don't speak English, what exactly happens? You're on mute, Deborah, if you're wanting to talk.
Sorry, so I've just got a plumber drilling below me, but he's stopped for now. So if you apply for refugee status in New Zealand, you're eligible to have a lawyer and to have an application for legal aid. Generally speaking, legal aid will be granted if you can show you have a case with reasonable prospects of success. And then there is an interpreter translator budget. In my experience, the issues with interpreters is not that great an issue. Yeah, but what is a big issue is are the cultural barriers for people understanding the processes and being able to navigate the various systems. And so having a social worker with an interpreter is incredibly important.
Okay, great. And just a question that's just come up. Do asylum seekers, convention refugees also get to go to the Mangere Refugee Resettlement Center?
You can only go to the Maurice Refugee Settlement Centre if you're an asylum seeker, if you've been detained, and then you're there. And so we've got this very uncomfortable situation at the Maurice Settlement Centre where you've got quota refugees who are people who have been brought in on the red carpet, if you like, with residence and language programs, and they're starting their whole life here. And then you've got this group of asylum seekers who are terrified because they're going through this really difficult legal process that if it's declined, they're on the first plane out and they don't have access to language classes and the food and all of that. So they're, it's a very unsatisfactory arrangement at the Maurice Centre, which is something I've opposed for decades.
And so I guess this brings us to a fundamental question, which is why are convention and quota refugees treated differently?
Well, they're treated differently because until you're recognised as a convention refugee, you're an asylum seeker, that you might not be found to be a refugee. So by law, you don't then have the legal right to access services. However, something that's important to remember about being granted refugee status is that it's recognising you're a refugee, so it's declaratory. It's not constitutive. It doesn't make you a refugee. It just declares that you were one all along. So what we're running, what's happening is for the year or 2 years of misery we're putting people through when they're recognised as a refugee, we've actually been depriving a refugee of, those basic rights for all that time. There is a certain, problem because, people do need to go through a legal system and a process. For me, what I'm, most concerned about is the nature of that legal process and just how arduous it is, and how traumatic it is. And if I had, 3 wishes, one of them would be that we had a trauma-informed process, that asylum seekers were treated more humanely through the legal process at all levels.
Yeah, I just also like to add, it's interesting. It seems to be a government policy based around when you talk to people that asylum seekers have been here for a number of years, so don't need the support that a quota refugee does who's a recent arrival. But I guess from our point of view, it doesn't understand the journey an asylum seeker goes on in New Zealand, that waiting, that unknown, the sitting at home. Maybe they get a work visa, maybe they don't. They're not able to integrate. They don't have a chance to understand what New Zealand society is like because they're just sitting waiting. They don't know what country they're going to be in a year's time. So I just think that immigration and the government just need to understand that asylum seekers aren't people that have lived there for 2 years and understood the whole system. They've just been in a bit of limbo, and then they've been granted the status. They need the support from them.
Thanks, Tim. Bernard, one of the questions that come in is, do all asylum seekers stay in prison when they go through the application process?
No, not at all. I think the numbers that are actually in the minority. Many asylum seekers will be in the community at the time they make their claim for refugee status determination. Some might make it at the border at the airport. And if there are reasons for which immigration thinks that the person maybe could be a security risk or relating to how they got into the country with a false or fraudulent passport, or may have destroyed that, and then that's where they get detained in prison. Yeah.
Okay,
but
thanks.
that is in the minority. Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying that, Bernard. Another question's come in, Deborah, that basically people are asking, what happens to a person when they get declined? Do they go back to their country of origin? What exactly happens?
So if someone is declined at the refugee status unit, they can apply to the Immigration Protection Tribunal. If you're declined by the tribunal, then if there's been an error on a point of law, then you can go to the High Court, but that's extremely difficult to do. Essentially, then the person is, in terms of the refugee system, that's the end of it really. And many do make a special direction to the minister and so on, but that's the absolute discretion of the minister. There's no right to reasons or anything. You can only apply for refugee status again if you can show a significant change in circumstances. So you can't just keep going around and around the system, applying again and again. You have to, have something significant. And one issue of concern that I have is when we do deport asylum seekers, that there is failed asylum seekers, that there is no monitoring of what happens to those people when they are deported. And there's a few different categories of how failed asylum seekers can be deported, which is important to understand. Those who are detained are at the most risk because they're detained in something called the turnaround provisions of the Immigration Act, which means they've never been designated to be here, which means that a civil aviation convention applies, which means that the person can be immediately bounced back to the last port where they embark to New Zealand. So if it's, for example, like Malaysia or Singapore, the person is pretty much straight away sent back to that port, and then that port can bounce them back to the previous port. So they're at very high risk of getting sent back to their country. For others who have failed, and they're subject to a deportation order, then they can make their own voluntary arrangements to leave. And so where claimants have options to go to other countries, they sometimes do that. But there are some claimants that are deported back to their home country. And I have had now a number of clients who were rejected in New Zealand, returned to their home country, tortured, and then they came back to New Zealand and claimed again and were recognised as refugees. And so those cases are always in my mind because that is an example of the New Zealand system failing and making mistakes. And all systems can fail, but we must be able to learn from our failures. And there is no record or formal monitoring of those people or those cases. Often those cases, people don't know about them because it's publication suppressed and so on. But it does happen. Reform from New Zealand, return to harm does happen. And it's the fear that refugee lawyers live with every single case we do.
That's really helpful, and I think it really highlights just the high stakes that all of this is actually occurring on. There's been a question, which is, what happens to children who are part of this process?
It's a very contentious issue in our sector, the treatment of children, refugee claimants. So the system requires every member of a family claiming refugee status to submit their own form and go through their own process. Back in the day, it used to be mum or dad applied and then the children were part of the parents' application. Now it's each individual family member. And so then the question is, well, how are the children treated? There are some guidelines that have been issued by the Refugee Status Unit that have been the subject of much controversy. And there is at the moment a review into the Refugee Status Unit, well, that was completed last year, and as part of that Casey review, we should be looking at guidelines and processes, and I hope that we look at the children guidelines again, because there are instances of 4-year-olds being interviewed by officers about domestic violence without their parent in the room. And there is this real drive by many refugee protection officers to want to interview the children. They say it's because of New Zealand's obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child that the children have the right to express their wishes. But my view is that that convention also says that the child has the right to not express their views and to let their parent do it. But there's this real tension and controversy in the sector about the evidence of children, because, and one of the reasons for that is because children's evidence can be used to impugn their parents' case. So, for example, the parent might say we were visited by the Taliban, around Ramadan, and then the child will be asked, and the child will say no, and so then that will be used to impugn the parents' testimony. And children, if they've been interviewed and they know the family's case has been declined, take it on board and blame themselves. And in family law, there are very strong criteria on who can interview children, who can talk to children, and we don't have any of those kinds of safeguards in the refugee status determination system. This is an area I feel very passionate about and very concerned about.
Thanks, Deborah. I'm just wondering, Bernard, I mean, I'm aware that your PhD is on therapeutic jurisprudence, and you have been focused on some of these issues around giving testimony as evidence of your experience, which lays those grounds for establishing, well-founded fears of persecution and those sorts of things. Is there anything else that you'd want to say around some of these, around some of these issues around giving testimony and in the application process?
Yes, I think it's one of those area which as Deborah has highlighted before, that it's the main thing there is how credibility is assessed in New Zealand, and for many of the asylum seekers, and this is including my experiences, that often we get a strong sense that you're coming through a process where you're going through a process where it appears the interviewer is just trying to poke holes, to break your stories apart. So it seems there is a strong culture of disbelief. So or at times, even looking at other the experiences that I've gathered, there's also a strong sense that there is some like a predetermination. So the officer comes into the room perhaps with a mind that is already hard about certain things, and then it becomes difficult, because as an asylum seeker, if you're sitting and looking at someone when from the start you think this person is already made up their mind, then it's like you're fighting a loose battle. Virtually. So, but besides that, there are also some very good experiences about how officers that understands how to ask questions, and from the experience that I'm getting from the studies, that just give the person time to respond, not confrontational, not being judgmental, or actually very respectful, listens to what the lawyers is saying or the psychologists have advised in terms of this process, because for unfortunately it's one of those areas that you get into, and there is some very strong evidence of trauma or re-traumatization, and yeah, so
So it sounds like there's more than one way of trying to collect testimony and evidence is what you're saying, and that there might be some ways of doing that in ways that might even be more capable of promoting well-being or taking someone's well-being into account, I suppose. One of the things that you mentioned, Bernard, was this idea of a culture of disbelief. And one of the other questions, I've also seen some questions that have popped in that have spoken about how asylum seekers is a highly politicized environment.
yes.
Any of you help the audience to sort of understand why it might be that asylum seekers is a politicized issue?
Yeah, it's a good question. Why? I guess a lot of politics maybe is based around immigration issues. You can see some of the comments come through on the stories you do on the Facebook posts. And it's used, and it is used in New Zealand politically. Where we saw the Beirut's decision and the National Party's attempt to try and politicise that. We're lucky that politicians in New Zealand don't influence the claim process, but they do have a large influence. The current government spends over $8 million a year stopping mass boat arrivals of asylum seekers in New Zealand. And we spend something like, and I'm not 100% sure, but something like $5 million a year in all of our resettlement money of all our refugees. So we do spend a lot more money trying to stop these mass boat arrivals coming than we do trying to resettle people, which is another issue that we have.
Thanks, Tim. Any other thoughts on that? How it's become a political issue?
Well, immigration law, refugee law is on the line of law and politics. And I think one of the reasons for that is because it's an area where the executive of government is, it's an area of sovereignty of a government deciding who can and cannot, come through its border. And so, it seemed to be a challenge to sovereignty, people coming through a border without permission and claiming asylum. So it's just seemed to be, it's just the tension of sovereignty. Okay.
So look, I mean, we've spoken about quite a few issues here, and also even I think even the challenges within the system to actually do this, where they're able to ensure this sovereignty, to ensure that there's a robust process, but also one that also focuses on well-being, which I imagine is a very tricky line to follow. One of the questions that's just been posed is, what, if any, are there any positives to the system? Is there anything positive about the system or anything positive overall about seeking asylum that you'd want to highlight?
Yeah,
Bernard?
I guess,
Tim?
I'll just start. Just on a practical point of view, we do a couple of things really well. With healthcare, so asylum seekers are entitled to healthcare just the same as anybody in New Zealand, so they can go to the doctor and pay the surcharge and go to hospital, so that's positive. Also, schooling for school-age children under 18s is free for people while they're seeking asylum, so children are able to go to school, which is good. Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of gratitude about the refugee system. I am a strong critic of the system, but I also, it's, first of all, it's very good New Zealand's a signatory to the Refugee Convention. It's very good we've got a refugee status determination system. And I think everybody involved in the legal process, the decision makers, they consider themselves as being part of an internationally recognised system. New Zealand decision makers are very proud of the New Zealand system and consider us to have a very good one. And I think, relatively speaking, relative to other countries, we do. I think according to normative standards, I'm quite critical, but I think that is good that there is an intention in the system to be a good and functional system. In reality, I think it's a highly dysfunctional system, but it's good that the intention is there, and that is something to build upon. Yeah.
Yes, that has been a very difficult one for me, but I'm thinking about the lawyers and the determination officers that put in their best and even the community support workers like ASST and REST New Zealand that putting their best to support asylum seekers. So it depends on the perspective of where the officers coming from. For those that have the good experience of or knowledge of like trauma-informed interviewing skills, the process is good, and that has been highlighted in the study that I'm doing. And more especially at the appeal level, there's more of that kind of discourse that indicates that the way we do it, the way it's done, there can be some people can feel like humans, just the way they have been treated, despite that the decision might end up not being what they desire, but the appreciation is there. So I have those kind of cases that so many of them in the community where the officers just understands the trauma that could be there or that might emerge in the room and ask questions in ways that allow for an appropriate for the person to put themselves together before they respond, and it's good. Yeah.
Okay, and I guess go ahead, Deborah.
I do feel I do also need to just say that we are very fortunate that we have a legal aid system with the Ministry of Justice, and that that has been a stable system, because without that I would hate to think what would happen. And we do have some exceptional individuals in the determination system in terms of professionals and decision makers that have really helped New Zealand to keep a good reputation.
Great. I guess before we start looking to wrap things up, I want to come back to this idea that Deborah mentioned of almost trying to thread the needle and then climbing the mountain. And it sounds like there's a lot of complex processes, some of which are hard to understand and might be hard to even engage with. But we've got quite a few people on this webinar. I'm sort of wondering if you have any thoughts around how is it that the wider society might be able to help people to climb this mountain, whether it's as asylum seekers or as convention refugees?
I can speak from the practical point of view, and it's I guess it's welcome. Welcome is one of our key visions. So welcoming people. If all asylum seekers come here trying to escape from something, whether it meets the standard of a refugee, is to be determined by the government. So it's just about welcoming people and realizing that they're not migrants. They haven't chosen to come to New Zealand. They've been forced to leave their home country. They don't want to leave their home country, their business, their family, everything. They're forced to leave for their own safety and the safety of their family. So understanding that, I think, would be key. If we can get more people to realize that, I think that attitudes would change a lot.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, I think also, for people just to take the imaginative leap and imagine if it was them needing to leave their country, New Zealand, going to a foreign country and needing help, desperately needing help, and imagining what it would be like. I know for myself, all these years, I always try to imagine that my client is my brother or my sister in a foreign land. How would I want the lawyer to treat them? And that's the type of lawyer I try to be. And so I think if people could just take that imaginative leap of putting themselves in the shoes of someone really needing help in a foreign land.
Right.
There's one interesting, I was looking up the UN reports. Last 2019, 63 people from New Zealand claimed asylum overseas. And the year before, 2018, 57 people from New Zealand claimed asylum overseas. So it's not a far reach. There's people that we know in our communities that have had to leave this country for their own safety.
That's great. I mean, I guess that sort of really highlights the idea of the Refugee Convention, that it isn't a particular ethnicity or nationality or gender or age. The Refugee Convention is for everyone. Is there anything that you'd like to say, Bernard?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone that is involved in this space and doing a lot of work to support asylum seekers, especially given that, as we've highlighted through this discourse, there is the funding, the funding for asylum seekers is not coming from the government, but from community organizations. So I just want to thank all the social workers, the lawyers, and even the determination officers that are putting in their best to ensure that the process is as safe and better as it can be.
Okay, well, thanks, Bernard. And I guess this is just the last question that I have for you before we close things up. But I don't know, maybe in a sentence or two, just if you would think that there's one thing that would make seeking asylum in New Zealand better, what would that be?
Don't put them in prison. They are not criminals.
Right.
Yeah.
Well said, Bernard.
For me, it would be ensure that there is mental health professionals available to refugee claimants, particularly psychologists. Support RAS, support the funding for RAS for them to be able to, work with asylum seekers. That's been a real challenge for RAS. But when we've got mental health professionals in the process, it becomes a trauma-informed process. And above all, that's what we need, a trauma-informed refugee status determination process.
Thanks, Deborah.
Yeah, I obviously agree with Bernard and Deborah. So the other thing I could add in is work rights. All people going through the process of seeking asylum should be given work rights. We've got too many people in New Zealand waiting for a decision who are surviving on $0. They've been forced into criminal acts or servitude. So all people in the asylum process should be given work rights.
Fantastic. Well, look, I'd like to thank our three panelists, Bernard, Tim, and Deborah, for offering their insights and perspective and passion in the in this asylum space. It's been really great, and I'd particularly also like to thank the audience for sending through so many questions and comments. And my apologies if we weren't able to get to them all. There are opportunities to engage with us further if you want to be in touch with RAS New Zealand. Or even with some of us individually. You can check out the Asylum Seeker Support Trust. You can check out Bernard's doctoral research. So there are further ways to engage. And there is also literature that's available that will help you to read about asylum seekers, convention refugees, and quota refugees that is specific to New Zealand. So what I would just like to end with is a karakia, which is unahia, unahia, unahia ke te uru tapu nui, ki watia, kia mama, te nako, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takata, koi ra I rongo, whakaaria, ake ki runga, ki tina, huie, takie. I'd like to thank you all for attending the second RAS New Zealand webinar. In 2 days' time, we'll be hosting another one on youth perspectives. We hope to see you there. We wish you all well in these uncertain times. Take care. Noho ora mai. Kia ora.
Thank you.